Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I'd like to just start by acknowledging the land that we're on, which is Mississauga territory. We're in Williams Treaty. And I just want to recognize as a settler that I am here as a guest and that I am here considering today my responsibilities as a settler and thinking about the fact that along with the rights, I have responsibilities to mend and repair and strengthen relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And in acknowledging that, I just encourage everyone to take a moment to do a little bit of research, if you haven't already, to learn about what land that you're on. There's a great website called nativeland.com.ca. Does anyone know? Anyway, Google native land and you will find a great resource that will help you to start that journey. But I really encourage everyone to think about a land acknowledgement as a process for reflection. And so as an organization, we've been taking the time, each person and each program, to think about what they would like to say in a land acknowledgement. And so it may change every time, but for me personally, I live on property in the country. And so I think every day as I go for walks, I think about what it means to be on the land and what I can do to really honor the land and to pay my respect to the land. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity, but I also think very regularly about what that means and how I can restore positive relationships in my community. So thanks very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Becky to start us off.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for anyone viewing this video. And I just want to say thank you to the group that has come together today to share thoughts and reflections. I wanted to thank the Stories for Hope Community Committee for joining us. And today we have with us Mel McGrory from CKL, Tales or Traveling Tales. We have Angela Connors from the Community Race and Relations Committee, Yvonne Lay from the New Canadian Centre. From Compass Early Learning and Care, we have Hannah McFarlane, Jill Wickens, and Diane Trainer. And of course, Ellen and myself from Investing in Quality Peterborough. So thank you very much to all of you for participating in this event today. The purpose for this session is to begin some meaningful conversations about the impacts and effects that residential schools have had on Indigenous families and communities. And we're hoping that this session will begin some reflective thinking for you about how you can begin, we all can begin bridges to reconciliation together, and maybe even to ask ourselves individually, what is one concrete action that we can take to begin this process? And we really feel that as educators, we have a moral responsibility to the children in our care to tell the truths about residential schools and to have age-appropriate conversations with children about residential schools. And it's a big topic. It may feel uncomfortable for some of us to talk about this topic, but I really feel like our educator community is a safe place to begin those conversations. And it's okay if we don't have all the answers. Children often ask questions we're not expecting. And, we often say we're not sure. How can we find that information out, or who can we go to? And I think that our knowledge keepers, our Indigenous knowledge keepers, are great first people to connect with to bring our questions forward. So I just want to say that today we're going to offer 3 stories for you to consider and then have a short follow-up discussion. So I'm going to introduce Ellen Mortlock, and she's going to read the story When I Was 8.
Great. Thanks for putting the story up. So I'm going to read When I Was 8 by Christy Jordan Fenton and Margaret Pokiak Fenton, and the art was done by Gabrielle Grimard. I knew many things when I was 8. I knew how to keep the sled dogs quiet while Father snuck up on the caribou, and to bring the team to him after a kill. I knew the sun slept in the winter and woke in the summer. And I knew that when the sun warmed Arctic Ocean shrugged off its slumbering ice, we would cross it to trade furs with the outsiders. But I did not know how to read the outsiders' books. It was not enough to hear them from my older sister, Rosie. I longed to read them for myself. Although I begged like a hungry dog after scraps, Father would not let me go to the outsiders' school like Rosie. He knew things about the school that I did not. But my name is Uliman. That's U-Li-Man, the stubborn stone that sharpens the half-moon ulu knife used by our women. I wore away at him all through the winter, and when the sun awoke again and we traveled to trade with the outsiders, he reluctantly left me at their school. A black-cloaked nun cut my hair. I felt naked as my braids fell to the floor. Stripped of my warm parka, I was made to wear a thin pinafore and scratchy underwear with stockings too small to stay above my knees. My Inuit name was taken, and I was to be called Margaret. All I had left was a beautiful book my sister read about, a girl named Alice. I hugged it to my chest and tried to be brave like the girl in the story. Every day for weeks, we woke very early for chores. Instead of sitting in desks, we scrubbed the floor beneath them. We washed walls and dishes and laundry, and then we went to church and kneeled on our already aching knees to clean our souls. I worked hard, but it brought me no closer to being able to read. When the first skiff of snow returned and my hopes were nearly dead, the kindly head nun led us to a classroom and told us to be seated. At last, we were going to read. At the teacher's desk, behind the teacher's desk, sat the nun who had cut my hair. I didn't want her for a teacher, but I sat very tall so she would know I was eager. A few older girls raised their hands, so I did too. The nun laughed and motioned for me to stand and read. Read? I couldn't even speak English. I scowled at her as the others giggled. Instead of learning to read that day, I spent the rest of the class with my nose in the corner and my stockings slouched around my ankles. The nun constantly gave me extra chores as part of my education, she said. But though my muscles ached from the hard work and I could barely keep my eyes open, she could not wear out my determination. I used every task as an opportunity to learn new words. I studied each letter of the alphabet before wiping it from the board. I looked at the labels on cleaning supplies and sounded out the words. I even studied the writing beneath pictures in the hall. These things improved my reading, but I longed to read an actual book, my book. One evening, I hurried through my supper of cabbage soup, planning a hasty escape. I couldn't wait anymore. I dashed into the hall, but the nun was waiting for me. Not so fast, Margaret. There are pots to be scrubbed, she said in a threatening tone, and marched me to the kitchen. With my arms in scalding water up to my elbows, I couldn't hold back my frustration. I could be reading, I muttered. What? The nun demanded, her shoes creaking as she crossed the kitchen. She pinned me against the sink. Slowly, a smile spread across her thin lips. Fetch me a cabbage from the basement, she ordered. I'd heard stories of children who disappeared down that dark cavern. I descended each step deliberately, hiding my fear. My hands quickly found a cabbage in the shadows, and I scurried up the stairs. But she slammed the door, shutting out all light. I pulled the handle. It was locked. A scream built in my chest, but I held it in. I closed my eyes, pulled up my stockings, and breathed deeply until I could feel my father's presence. He wrapped his arms around me in the darkness, and I spelled out my Inuit name to him, whispering, O-L-E-M-A-U-N. His proud smile made me stronger, so I worked through the name of my distant land. B-A-N-K-S-I-S-L-A-N-D. I spelled many things from home and was starting on the title of my book, A-L-I, when the door opened. I squeezed past the nun and returned to the sink. Her angry black eyes raised goosebumps on the back of my shaved neck, but she could not make me cry. When I returned to the dorm that night, all the girls were giddy. Everyone had beautiful new stockings. I pulled off my old ones, took my place in front of the nun, held out my hands, closed my eyes. The nun cackled loudly as she handed my pair to me. Laughter instantly filled the room. They're red, I stammered in disbelief. Only circus clowns wore red stockings. I ran to my bed and opened my book. I stared at the letters, holding back my tears until those letters became words, which grew into a familiar story. I could almost hear my sister's voice reading about the cruel queen, and I let the story carry me far away from the laughter. The next morning, I crept quietly to breakfast, but an older girl saw me and called out, "Fatty legs," as bits of food fell from her mouth. "Fatty face," I shouted back. "F-A-T-T," the nun swooped in. "If you cannot get along with the others, you can tend to the laundry," she hissed. I entered the laundry and stood beside the large vat with the fire crackling beneath it. And then the idea came to me. I knew what to do with my stockings. I burned them to ashes. I felt like Alice after a bite of magic cake as large as the entire room. When the nun saw my bare legs, she exploded. "Margaret, put on your stockings," she demanded. I set my jaw, crossed my arms. "I can't." "Why not?" "I just can't." Her face grew very red, and she ordered everyone to search the room. Like the queen's henchmen in my book, they scurried around, upturning everything. Books were torn from shelves and blankets from beds. No one was calling me fatty legs now, and no amount of searching could ever bring those stockings back. The nun snarled when I was allowed another pair. In my new thick gray stockings, I felt victorious. But when I strode into class the next day, the nun slammed a book on my desk. It was a green reader like the older girls used. "Page 34, she said. She wanted to cut me down to size. I opened the book, nervousness swelling in my throat. I looked at the words and began slowly twisting my tongue around the consonants and forming my mouth around the vowels. By the second paragraph, I confidently sliced through the words without a single moment of hesitation. There was no stopping me. When I finished, I looked up, but the nun was facing the blackboard. "Sit down, Margaret," she said. I felt a great happiness inside that I dared not show. I quietly took my seat. I was Uliman, conqueror of evil, reader of books. I was a girl who traveled to a strange and faraway land to stand against a tyrant like Alice. And like Alice, I was brave, clever, and as unyielding as the strong stone that sharpens an ulu. I finally knew this, like I knew many things, because now I could read. Thanks for turning the pages for me.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you. I'm going to call on Yvonne Lay now to read Not My Girl.
So Not My Girl is a follow-up to When I Was 8, and the story explores what it was like when returning home after spending 2 years at the residential school. Not My Girl is written by Christy Jordan Fenton and Margaret Pokiak Fenton, with art by Gabrielle Grimard. It was as though the wings of 1,000 birds soared in my heart, propelling me back to my family. I leapt over the side of the boat and ran toward my mother. Her face remained as still as stone. "Not my girl," she called in what little English she knew. The birds in my heart fell from the sky. I caught a glint of my own reflection in my mother's hard eyes. The long braids she had once lovingly plaited had been cut away, along with everything she remembered of me. I had grown tall and very thin from 2 years of hard chores and poor meals at the outsider's school. When I left for Aklavik, I was just 8. Now I was 10. In that time, I had learned how to add numbers and how to read books. I had perfect table manners and knew when to say my prayers. I could speak English and French, but I no longer knew the words in my own language to tell my mother that I was her girl. "Not my girl," rang out again, like the slap of a ruler on a desk. I turned to my sisters and brother. They just stared. I tended to run, but my father caught me in a tight embrace. Uliman, he whispered. I had not heard my Inuit name in so long, I thought it might shatter like an eggshell with the weight of my father's voice. At the school, I was known only by my Christian name, Margaret. I buried my head in my father's smoky parka, turning it wet with tears. I felt a touch much gentler than my father's strong grasp as my mother's arms joined his. Together, they sheltered me in that safe place between them. I took a piece of muktuk and shoved it in my mouth. I chewed it and tried to wrestle the rubbery chunk down, but my throat closed and my stomach turned. I had to spit it out. I followed my family home silently. As they honked away like a gaggle of geese, I wondered what kind of bird I had become. I no longer felt like I belonged to this flock. As we neared our tent, I caught sight of my father's sled dogs. I ran eagerly toward one, but she sprang at me with a fierce snap. Wait until you wear our scent again, Uliman, my father said, reassuring me with the English he had learned as a boy at an outsider's school. My first few weeks at home were difficult. I could not eat the food my mother prepared. I relied on my father to translate almost everything, and I had lost the skills I needed to be useful. I couldn't set traps, skin hares, or pluck geese. I knew how to recite verses and make my bed, but those things did not help feed the family. I wished my older sister had not moved away. She had been to the outsider school. She would have understood how hard it was to return home a stranger. One day after I tangled a fishing net, my mother gestured for me to go play. I ran straight from my friend Agnes's house. She was my best friend from school, and I wanted to see if she would like to go hunting for goose eggs, a food we both loved. Her mother met me at the door with a stern look. Agnes joined her. My mother and father say I am an outsider now. They do not want me playing with children from the school, Agnes said timidly before closing the door. Agnes was my only friend. Her words stung almost as deeply as my mother saying, "Not my girl." Dizzy with hunger and disappointment, I stumbled home. A dog leapt up as I approached. Wanting to know if I would always be an outsider, I offered a hand. The dog answered with a snarl and a flash of sharp teeth that nearly took off my fingers. I retreated to a corner of the tent and hid in my favorite book until my family returned. My sisters had caught many fish and I was jealous. Then my mother placed her ulu in my hands. She guided the knife up the fish's belly, patiently showing me how to gut it. That night, as I reached for a piece of fish, I thought for a moment how embarrassed I would be if the nuns could see me eating with my hands. But I was proud that I had helped to prepare the fish, and it had been a long while since we had a meal I could eat, so I gorged myself. When the air turned crisp again, one of the dogs had a litter of pups. Agnes would love them. I had relearned many of the words of my people, so I decided to try to see her again. I carefully snatched a soft pup, belted it into the back of my parka like a baby, and set off. My hand trembled as it struck her door. No one answered. After a long wait, I gave up. I walked down to the beach, took out my puppy and played with it, and sang it songs I remembered from school. Arriving home late for supper, I quickly stripped off my parka, forgetting the puppy. My father leapt and caught it just before it hit the floor. "Uliman," my mother shouted. As I looked at the nearly lifeless body, I felt a searing of cold remorse. "How long have you had this puppy?" my father asked. I shrugged. "Since morning." My father knelt down. "Uliman, puppies need their mother's milk." "Will it die?" I asked. "I'm not sure," he said sadly. It was all too much. I turned and ran out into the night where the iridescent fronds of the northern lights danced down from the sky. Grandmother once told me that if I whistled to them, their tendrils would reach down and snatch me away. I whistled until my lips hurt, but they ignored me. Instead of scolding me when I returned, my father called me to the fire and handed me an eyedropper. I took it, sucked up some rice water, and released it into the puppy's mouth. I had nursed patients at the hospital next to the school and knew how to care for the sick. I stayed up all night feeding my little patient. In the morning, we took the puppy outside. At first, his mother pushed him away. He whimpered. Like me, he no longer carried his family's scent. I closed my eyes and wished with all my heart I'd never taken him. When I looked again, his mother was licking him. My father squeezed me to him and smiled. By the time the snows came, eating was getting easier. And while I was still happy to share my Mortlock with the puppy, I kept the Pipsy for myself. I had regained my family's scent and often helped my father with the dogs. One day he asked me to join him on a hunting trip. I was ecstatic. I loved traveling by dog sled. We were far out on the barren tundra when my father asked, "Uliman, do you know the dog commands?" "Yes," I said confidently. "G means go right and left is haw." He laughed, hopping off and leaving me in command. The dogs were moving fast and my heart was racing. "Haw," I called excitedly, meaning to avoid the pond on the left. But I had confused my commands. The dogs went toward the pond. "Gee, gee," I shouted. The dogs bolted sharply right. "Haw, haw," I countered. They darted so quickly left, I nearly flew off the sled. Panicked, I repeated, "Haw, haw." My command tamed the line into a tight coil that slowed to a gradual stop. "Atta girl, Uliman," my father shouted. As we rode back to town, I felt proud standing ahead of him on the runners. I was sure he was proud too. He let me drive often after that. On Christmas morning, I awoke to the smell of bannock. My father sat like Santa with a load of presents. He gave my brother a train and my sisters beautiful porcelain dolls. There was nothing for me. I cried. I had tried so hard, but I still did not belong. "What's wrong?" my father asked. "I wanted a doll," I sobbed. "I thought you were too old for dolls," he teased. "Maybe you're not big enough for your own dog sled." My own dog sled! I ran outside to find 6 dogs hitched to a new sled. I hopped on and drove around and around town beneath the dancing northern lights. I passed by Agnes and her mother. At that speed, I could not see their expressions, but they both waved and cheered. As I neared home, I saw that my father had his own team of dogs hitched and my brother and sisters loaded on his sled. I slowed, allowing my mother to climb on the runners behind me, my eyelashes freezing with tears. As we all sped off like a swift winged flock, the sound of my mother's voice filled my ears. "My girl," she shouted proudly, and the birds rose up in my heart to soar high once again.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I'm going to call on Angela Connors to read When We Were Alone.
Thank you. Okay, When We Were Alone by David A. Robertson and Juliet Flett. Today I helped my kokum in her flower garden. She always wears colorful clothes. It's like she dresses in rainbows. When she bent down to prune some of the flowers, I couldn't even see her because she blended in with them. She was like a chameleon. "Nokum, why do you wear so many colors?" I asked. Nokum said, "Well, Nosium, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I wore many different colors. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they gave us different clothes to wear. All the children were dressed the same, and our clothes weren't colorful at all. We all mixed together like storm clouds." "Why did you have to dress like that?" I asked. "They didn't like that we wore such beautiful colors," Nokum said. They wanted us to look like everybody else. But sometimes in the fall, when we were alone and the leaves had turned to their warm autumn hues, we would roll around on the ground. We would pile the leaves over our clothes they had given us, and we would be colorful again. And this made us happy. Now, Nosim said, I always wear the most beautiful colors. After I helped with the flowers, we went over to the back gate. There were vines covering the gate, and they reached all the way to the ground. When my kokum turned to fix the latch, I saw that her braid hung almost as low as the vines. It was like she had a tail. Nokum, why do you wear your hair so long? I asked. Nokum said, well, Nosim, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I grew our hair long, just like our people had always done. It made us feel strong and proud. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they cut off all our hair. Our strands of hair mixed together on the ground, like blades of dead grass. Why did you have to wear your hair like that? I asked. They didn't like that we were proud, Nokum said. They wanted us to be like everyone else. But sometimes in the spring, when we were alone and the grass had grown so long and thick in the field, we would pick blades from the ground. We would braid them into short hair they had given us, and we would have long hair again, and this made us happy. Now, Nokum said, I always wear my hair very long. After my kokum had fixed the latch, I followed her to the birdhouse. There was a bird flying through the air like a jingle dress dancer. She fed the bird and whispered, Napinasis mikros ta mixikikanta miktas. And her words sounded like a poem. Nokum, why do you speak Cree? I asked. Well, Nokum said, well, Nosium. When I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I always spoke our language. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they wouldn't let us speak our words. All the children used their strange words, and we didn't understand them at all. Our voices blended together like a flock of crows. Why did you have to talk their language? I asked. They didn't like us to speak our language, Nokum said. They wanted us to be like everybody else. But sometimes in the summer, when we were alone and our teachers weren't anywhere around the place we were, we would whisper to each other in Cree. We would say all the words we weren't allowed to say, and so that we wouldn't forget them. And this made us happy. Now, Nokum said, I always speak my language. After our gardening work was done, I sat with my kokum in the backyard. Her brothers came over and sat with us. He comes over all the time. We drank tea and ate bannock. The tea was hot and sweet, and the bannock was moist and warm and melted in my mouth. My kokum said my uncle talked and laughed like children. Nokum, why do you and Nokumis always spend time together? I asked. Nokum said, well, Nosam, when we were your age, at home in our community, being with family was the most important thing. We played with each other, did chores together, and shared everything. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they wouldn't let us be together. My brother and I were separated, like day and night. Why were you and Nokomis separated? I asked. They didn't like when we were with family, Nokum said, because when we were together, we thought too much of home. But sometimes in the winter, when we were alone and we were sure that nobody could see us, we would find each other. We would take off our mitts, and in the crisp cold air, we would hold hands so we could be with each other. And this made us happy. Now, Nokum said, as she reached over and held my uncle's hand and mine, I am always with my family.
Thank you so much, Angela. Those are very powerful stories. Mel McGorry is going to lead us through a discussion now. Welcome, Mel.
Hello there. So thank you, Ellen, Yvonne, and Angela for reading the stories. They're, every time I hear them, it really impacts upon me in different ways. These stories are very powerful and they're interwoven themes of belonging. In what ways do these stories speak to you about the importance of belonging?
I myself just think about all of the characters in the stories' experiences of having to eat strange food or food they're not familiar with, and having to speak a language they don't know, and being pulled away from their families, and how that really impacted their well-being.
And also how when Uliman went back home, it was just like starting over too. It was like being at the school and not understanding the language and knowing the food. She had to do that all over again with her own family, which would have been really, really hard.
Yeah, and in the Uliman stories, one of the things that really jumped out at me as the readings were happening is when she says, I regained my family's scent. And I thought there were so many different metaphors throughout those stories that speak to this issue of the importance of belonging. And, you know, whether it was from the dogs not recognizing her scent, to her mother saying, not my girl, to her friend not being allowed to play with her because she had gone to the outsider school, all of those things, and kind of taking us on that journey where she then at the end gets that sense of belonging again.
I was drawn to the last story, the idea about pride in that one example that she talks, and that this pride of who we are in our family, and this connects to this feeling that like I belong if I can feel proud about who I am or how I act with the people that I'm around. So the word pride I was drawn to.
You know, I found that listening to the story, you know, when she was taken away, the scent stood out for me as well, because how our senses can give us these memories, and the scent, even when she arrived home, and I was thinking of the air, the smell of the air, how different it would be, you know, being by the waters and the ocean. And it reminds me of when I go home to Ireland, and as soon as I get off the airplane, it's the smell that I realize, oh my God, I'm at home. The air is so different and easier to breathe. It's not dry, it's damp, you know what I mean? It's easier. So when she was talking about when she arrived, the scent, and I was thinking, what would the smell like be in the schools? And those memories that are created from that, the scent. So that really stood out for me. And it says, as we read When We're Alone, I kept thinking about the resilience Newcomb demonstrated despite the trauma she endured. What themes regarding resilience spoke to you in the story?
I think Uliman's, like, her whole attitude, right? She was very resilient. She burned those stockings, and when she was in the basement, she thought of home and felt like she always seemed to find a way to kind of keep herself calm and overcome the trials she was going through. So that was amazing resilience on her part.
What I resonated with me in her story, and I wrote down several times, determination, 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 not to give up, not to let this person, you know, take away her spirit and who she was by repeating her name and her homeland, and having her arms of her father around her. Yeah, that one was very powerful for me.
I think about Newcomb demonstrating resilience almost in a form of gratitude. So she, you know, wore colorful clothes because she had been deprived of that in the residential schools. and she spent time with her brother, and she did things that she enjoyed that reminded her of her culture and her family. And so to me, that really spoke to gratitude.
I would add to that the resilience is demonstrated when she's reliving those traumatic experiences that she had and then sharing them on with the next generation. The hope, I think, that we can push through that trauma to something that is more positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this issue of resilience, I mean, we talk about it as, you know, being a positive thing, but as Yvonne, you know, spoke to, it's coming out of trying to manage trauma, right? And, you know, oftentimes when I think about resilience, you have to think about, you know, almost being forced to become resilient given the situations that they were put in, right? And so it's kind of this twofold idea about resilience. Yes, you know, we want as a positive thing to be able to build resilience against trauma or other experiences, but the other side of it is really considering why these traumas occurred, and for that resilience to have to then be part of the way that they continue on to kind of deal with it.
Yeah, I think this can be a very difficult topic to introduce to children, you know,
Yeah.
speaking to children. But the stories they're very beautiful, and it's a beautiful way to introduce the topics and speak to children about residential schools and families, and what might be some helpful things to consider before introducing the stories to children and families.
Well, for me, having to read a story that incorporated the Cree language was very daunting, and I'm sure that I messed it up because I'm still struggling with the Ojibwe language. So I think that is also something that, you know, in preparing to do this, that if there are traditional language words in the books, that there's an explanation about that, right? About where that comes from, why it's important, and maybe a little practicing beforehand to be able to give justice to it.
I was going to say this idea of just being brave and trying to put yourself out there and to try it. But of course, like Angela's saying, to read it ahead of time and read it with your teammates and read it with other adults and see what kind of things stir up in you, or just like we're doing right now, what are some of the themes that bubble up? And then that will help to build your confidence to want to think about what are the children drawn to when they have these. And I know that some of the children I've worked with are always drawn to this idea of the grandparents, or seeing that feeling of not having your family and being reunited and coming back together. And so it's fascinating to study it with children too, and see what they're drawn to in the or sometimes in the images, or it was interesting. Some can be related to, like, through COVID, they weren't able to see their grandparents, and so I found a few children will talk about their grandmother when they see them hug or something, that they'll think about that. So you can tell a lot of connecting to this idea of, wow, it's when you're away from people, how do you work through that?
Yeah, I think too, I would want to know as an educator if any of my families were in residential schools, because there may be trauma there. And so just to be aware of that. And so I might send a letter home just to families to let them know we're going to be looking at these books and exploring them. And also from the perspective that children will have questions and we'll talk about it. So just then, if parents have questions, they can reach out to us, and hopefully together we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really, really good point. That, you know, helping to kind of create that space, help parents to create that space, and definitely something that you want to give them a heads up on. Um, uh, and particularly, you know, as you mentioned, there may be children in the group that have had family members who were um, part of the residential school system. And oftentimes, in families who had members who were in residential schools, they haven't had the opportunity to have those conversations because of, you know, the trauma again of the folks that were in residential schools, not sharing those stories, not sharing those experiences. And it's only been recently, and I had this occur in my own family recently, when I was back home, and my young cousin, never realizing that her grandfather had been in residential schools. And it was only through the conversations that we've been having recently where this came up. And her, you know, her grandfather has since passed, and they were very close, but it was something that he never shared with her.
I think before we speak with children about this, I don't believe it should be the first introduction to Indigenous cultures for children, because it's very important to speak about. But again, we don't want children to view Indigenous peoples as like the victims of something, that be the predominant. I think there's such beautiful aspects and perspectives of cultures that are very rich to share with children before bringing in residential schools. I think that just creates a fuller understanding, and for educators themselves to learn at the time as well, myself included, learning more about the cultures, and with the beautiful picture books, are wonderful to show the different arts and different stories and mythology. I think that's very important to speak to prior to speaking to children about the experiences in residential schools.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Is that you, in exploring these topics, there needs to be that foundational knowledge again, right? So understanding that this is just one part of it, right? And kind of leading to that. Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
Absolutely, Mel and Angela. I would also add, as a parent, appealing to the kids through empathy, the questions like, how would you feel if this happened to us? And making it, breaking it down rather than having the whole story be absorbed all at once. And then with my kids, they also asked at the end, is it still like that now? Are they still taking children away now? And what can we do? So, is a bit of a call to action to be an ally, something that is a positive thing to introduce in that process when we're introducing these stories to children.
Do we have any other thoughts or around the stories, or anything that stood out for you?
Not anything specific about the stories, but I just want to kind of reinforce that this is such an important aspect of learning, right? And as Canadians, it's a part of our history, that there is such a rich cultural diversity across Turtle Island, and to be able to share these. And I agree with, kind of piecing it out a little bit so that you're not overwhelming children with some of this knowledge. But overall, I think that there's wonderful opportunities. And I know, I think that we have said this before, yes, these books are geared towards children, but it wouldn't hurt some adults to read them too. They could have a book study.
Absolutely. Great. Even when you're saying that, Angela, it makes me think about often supervisors run staff meetings with educators, and it would be powerful to read a story at the beginning of a staff meeting and have this kind of conversation just as the beginning to the meeting.
Great conversation starters for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, everybody. I want to thank the Stories of Hope Committee members for sharing their time and their extensive knowledge with us today to give us some new perspectives in discussing this important topic. We hope that as educators and working with young children, that it helps ignite some ideas for you in your journey in sharing the story of residential schools with your coworkers and your children and your families at home. And please feel free to contact Becky and I at Investing in Quality for book titles related to this theme. So thank you so much, everybody. And we hope you gathered some great ideas and just enjoyed the stories today. I know they're great stories. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.